The Ritual of Ashwick. The rain was an oddity in the American Southwest, a rare phenomenon that left the parched land thirsting for more. It beat against the cracked asphalt of an old highway, pooling in the shallow dips of the road, each droplet carrying with it the scent of the earth. It was the kind of night where shadows crept into the corners of your mind, whispering secrets only the damned could hear. This was no place for redemption. Catherine Davis, a seasoned FBI agent, sat in the back seat of the government-issued sedan. She was a woman of contradictions, fiercely dedicated to her job, yet haunted by the quiet suburban life she'd built with her husband and 2 children. The strain between the 2 worlds she inhabited was beginning to show, lines of fatigue etched into her otherwise sharp features, her eyes darkened by sleepless nights. She clutched her phone, staring at the last photo her husband had sent. Her kids, Emily and Jake, playing in the backyard, completely oblivious to the darkness their mother was knee-deep in. A tear welled up in the corner of her eye, but she blinked it away before anyone could notice. Next to her sat Jeremy Holcomb, a man who wore his bitterness like a badge of honor. At 35, he was the youngest of the trio, but carried with him a darkness that belied his years. He was a widower, and the wound of his wife's death had festered into something rotten. He had become a man obsessed, driven by a need to trap the guilty in the iron bars of the law, as though by doing so he could somehow avenge the life that had been stolen from him. His eyes were cold and calculating, always searching for the next piece of evidence, the next sign of guilt. He didn't trust anyone, not his colleagues, not the witnesses they interviewed, not even himself. Behind the wheel was Agent Wood, the old man of the team. At 50, he had seen more than his fair share of humanity's darker side. His once black hair was now peppered with gray, and his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. Wood was jaded, but he was also meticulous, by the book. He didn't believe in shortcuts, didn't believe in intuition. He believed in evidence, in facts. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this case was different, something that gnawed at the back of his mind like a persistent itch. The 3 agents had been on the road for days, chasing a phantom across the desolate stretches of the Southwest. A string of murders had been reported in small towns, each one more grisly than the last. The victims were always the same: a woman around 25, a man around 30, and a child no older than 6. The murders were ritualistic, the bodies arranged in a grotesque tableau that suggested some dark purpose. Each crime scene was marked with symbols, ancient and malevolent, etched into the walls in blood. "This is it," Wood said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and whiskey. The sedan pulled off the main road and onto a dirt path that led to an abandoned motel. The place had been a relic even in its heyday, a last-ditch stop for weary travelers before they ventured into the vast desert beyond. Now, it was a place where only ghosts remained. They got out of the car, the rain soaking them to the bone almost immediately. Catherine shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her. The air smelled of decay, the kind of rot that came from more than just abandonment. Jeremy looked at the building with disdain, as if the very sight of it offended him. Wood was already at the trunk, pulling out a flashlight and a pair of latex gloves. "Let's make this quick," he muttered. "I don't want to be out here longer than we have to." The motel was eerily silent as they approached, the rain muffling their footsteps. The sign out front flickered with the last of its dying neon, casting a sickly green glow over the entrance. The door creaked open under Wood's hand, and they stepped inside. The interior was a time capsule from the 1950s, faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, the furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. But there was something else here too, something that made Catherine's skin crawl. The smell of blood was thick in the air, mingling with the musty scent of decay. They moved through the lobby cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The ritualistic nature of the murders had left the local authorities baffled, but Catherine, Jeremy, and Wood had seen enough to know that this was more than just a string of random killings. The murders were connected, each one a piece of a larger puzzle. "Room 7, Jeremy said, his voice tight with barely concealed anger. "That's where they found the last victim." Catherine nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what they would find. The same scene they had seen before, the same horror, the same madness, but that didn't make it any easier. They reached room 7, the door ajar, the wood splintered where it had been forced open. The stench of death hit them like a physical blow. Catherine's hand went to her mouth, stifling a gag. Wood remained impassive, his face a mask of professionalism. Jeremy's eyes narrowed, and he pushed past them, stepping into the room. The sight that greeted them was worse than anything they had seen before. The bodies of a woman, a man, and a child were arranged in a triangular pattern on the floor, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Symbols were scrawled on the walls in blood, the same symbols they had seen at every other crime scene. But this time, there was something new, something that sent a chill down Catherine's spine. A figure had been drawn in the center of the triangle, a grotesque, shadowy thing with horns and eyes that seemed to follow them even in the dim light. Beneath the figure, a single word had been written, Baal. Catherine felt her knees go weak, and she leaned against the wall for support. She had heard the name before, whispered in hushed tones by the few occult experts they had consulted. Baal was an ancient god, a demon, a force of pure malevolence. The cult they were chasing was trying to summon him, to bring him into this world. "We need to get out of here," Wood said, his voice betraying a rare note of urgency. "Now!" But it was too late. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving of their own accord. Catherine felt a cold hand brush against her cheek, and she recoiled, her heart racing. Jeremy pulled out his gun, pointing it at the darkness, as if that could somehow protect them. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an unnatural light. Catherine felt a presence in the room, something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for them. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the weight of her own mortality pressing down on her. "Get a hold of yourself," Wood barked, grabbing Catherine by the arm and dragging her out of the room. Jeremy was right behind them, his gun still drawn, his face pale with fear. They stumbled out of the motel and into the rain, gasping for air as if they had been drowning. Catherine's hands were shaking, and she could feel the tears she had been holding back begin to spill over. Jeremy was muttering under his breath, curses and prayers mingling together in a desperate attempt to ward off whatever horror they had just encountered. Wood's face was set in a grim line, his eyes fixed on the motel as if he expected it to come alive at any moment. "We need to call for backup," Wood said, his voice tight with barely concealed fear. "This is bigger than us." But Catherine knew deep down that no amount of backup would make a difference. They were dealing with something far beyond the realm of the FBI, something that couldn't be stopped by bullets or handcuffs. This was evil, pure and unfiltered, and it was coming for them. As they drove away from the motel, the rain still pounding against the windshield, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure following them, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of highway disappearing into the darkness. "Where do we go from here?" Jeremy asked, his voice hollow. "We find the servant of Baal," Wood replied, his voice hard, "and we stop him before it's too late." Catherine knew that it wouldn't be that simple. The cult was everywhere, its tendrils reaching into the darkest corners of society. They were up against something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for this moment for centuries. And if they failed, it wouldn't just be their lives on the line, it would be the entire world. But there was no turning back now. The night was dark and full of shadows, and they were the only ones standing between the light and the abyss. Part 2. The Servant of Baal. The days bled into each other, a blur of dark highways and grim crime scenes. The trio was chasing shadows, following leads that led nowhere, or worse, deeper into the darkness. The murders continued, each one more horrific than the last, and each one inching them closer to the edge of despair. Catherine found herself growing distant, the weight of the case gnawing away at her like a disease. At night, she barely slept, her mind consumed by the images of the victims, their lifeless bodies twisted into grotesque shapes. When she did sleep, her dreams were haunted by visions of her children, their faces pale and lifeless, blood dripping from the corners of their mouths. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of their screams ringing in her ears. Jeremy was no better. The bitterness that had once fueled him had turned to poison, eating away at his soul. He became more reckless, more desperate, each failure pushing him further toward the brink. He started to see enemies everywhere, even among the few people they could trust. He would stare at the crime scenes with a cold, dead expression, as if trying to will himself to feel something, anything, other than the emptiness that consumed him. Wood remained steady, the anchor that kept them from drifting completely into madness. But even he couldn't hide the toll the case was taking. He had seen everything there was to see in his years with the Bureau, but this was different. This was something he couldn't rationalize, something that didn't fit into his neat categories of right and wrong. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were in over their heads. They followed the trail to a small town in New Mexico, a place that seemed to exist on the edge of reality, where the desert met the mountains and the sky stretched on forever. The town was a relic from another time, its streets lined with crumbling buildings and faded signs. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, to lose themselves in the emptiness of the land. The lead had come from an anonymous tip, a voice on the other end of the line that spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid of being overheard. The caller had given them an address, a name, Elijah Granger. He was a man of God, they said, a preacher who had fallen from grace, a man who had once been known as the servant of Baal. The trio arrived in the dead of night, the desert cold biting at their skin. The address led them to a dilapidated church on the outskirts of town, its windows shattered, the door hanging on its hinges. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and something else, something darker, more malevolent. They entered the church cautiously, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. The pews were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust, and the altar at the front of the room was bare, save for a single candle that flickered weakly in the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Catherine's heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She could feel something in the air, something wrong, something evil. She glanced at Jeremy, his face set in a grim expression, his hand on the grip of his gun. Wood was ahead of them, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, his every movement deliberate and controlled. They reached the altar, and that's when they saw him. Elijah Granger was kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped in prayer, his head bowed. He was an old man, his skin weathered and wrinkled, his hair a tangled mess of white. He was dressed in a tattered robe, and around his neck hung a pendant, a symbol they had seen at every crime scene, the mark of Baal. "Granger," Wood said, his voice hard and commanding. "Step away from the altar. We need to talk." The old man didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence. He just kept praying, his voice a low murmur, the words unintelligible. "Granger," Jeremy barked, stepping forward, his gun drawn. "Get up, now!" But the old man just kept praying, his voice growing louder, more insistent. Catherine could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, a cold dread settling in the pit of her stomach. This was wrong. All of this was wrong. Wood took a step closer, his flashlight trained on the old man. "Granger," I said. But before he could finish, Granger's head snapped up, his eyes wild, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. His voice rang out in the darkened church, clear and sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "He is coming," Granger said, his voice filled with a terrible glee. "He is coming, and there is nothing you can do to stop it." The words sent a chill down Catherine's spine. She could feel the darkness closing in around them, the air growing colder, thicker. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, to twist and writhe, as if alive. Jeremy stepped forward, his gun leveled at Granger's head. "Shut up! Shut the hell up!" But Granger just laughed, a terrible hollow sound that echoed through the church. "You're too late," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "He's already here." And then, with a sudden, violent movement, Granger pulled a knife from his robe and plunged it into his own chest. Blood spurted from the wound, splattering the altar, and Granger collapsed to the ground, his body twitching as the life drained out of him. Catherine's scream caught in her throat, her mind reeling from the horror of what she had just witnessed. Jeremy cursed and rushed forward, but it was too late. Granger was dead, his blood pooling on the floor, seeping into the cracks between the floorboards. Wood knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse, but he already knew the truth. Granger was gone, taking whatever secrets he had with him. "This can't be happening," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." But it was real. All of it. The murders, the cult, the servant of Baal. And now, with Granger's death, they were left with nothing. No leads, no answers, just a dead man and a lingering sense of dread. As they stood in the darkened church, the wind howling outside, Catherine could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had seen evil before, but this was different. This was something ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows for centuries, biding its time. And now, it was here. Part 3. The Abyss. The days that followed Granger's death were a blur of frustration and dead ends. The trio scoured the town, questioning locals, searching for any clue that might lead them to the heart of the cult. But the town was tight-lipped, the people wary of outsiders, especially those who came asking questions about things best left buried. Catherine found herself on the edge of despair. The case was slipping through their fingers, and with it, any hope of stopping whatever horror the cult was trying to unleash. She couldn't shake the image of her children from her mind, their innocent faces, their lives untouched by the darkness that consumed her own. She was supposed to protect them, to keep them safe, but how could she do that when she couldn't even protect herself? Jeremy grew more volatile, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He was like a man possessed, driven by a need to find someone, anyone, to blame. He would lash out at the smallest provocation, his paranoia growing with each passing day. Catherine could see the cracks forming, the darkness taking hold, and she feared what he might do if they didn't find a way to stop it. Wood remained stoic, but even he was starting to falter. He had been through hell before, but this was different. This was a battle they couldn't win with guns or badges. This was a battle for their very souls. They were sitting in the motel room they had been calling home for the past week, the air thick with tension. Wood was at the table, going over the case files for the 100th time, while Catherine and Jeremy sat on the edge of their beds, staring at the walls. "There has to be something we're missing," Wood muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something we're not seeing." "It's over," Jeremy snapped, his voice filled with bitterness. "Granger was our last lead, and now he's dead. We're chasing ghosts." Catherine said nothing, her mind racing. She knew Jeremy was right. They had hit a dead end, and the darkness was closing in. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they were missing, something hidden in plain sight, a piece of the puzzle they had overlooked. As the tension in the room thickened, Catherine's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She jumped at the sound, her heart skipping a beat. The number was unknown, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello," she said cautiously, her voice barely steady. There was a pause, then a voice crackled through the line, low, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a shiver down her spine. "He's waiting for you." Catherine's blood ran cold. "Who is this? What do you want?" The voice didn't answer her question. Instead, it delivered a chilling message. "The ruins, at midnight. Come alone if you want to save them." And then the line went dead. Catherine stared at the phone in her hand, her mind racing. She had no idea who the caller was or how they had gotten her number, but she knew, without a doubt, that this was the lead they had been waiting for. The ruins, they had passed them on the way into town, ancient stone remnants that whispered of a forgotten time, now mostly buried beneath the sand. Jeremy noticed her change in demeanor. "What's going on?" She hesitated, considering the voice's instructions, but hiding the truth from her team was out of the question. "I got a call. Someone wants to meet at the ruins at midnight." Wood looked up from the files, his eyes narrowing. "It could be a trap." "It probably is," Catherine admitted, "but we don't have any other options." "We go together," Wood said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Jeremy, despite his growing paranoia, nodded in agreement. He was on edge, but his instincts as an investigator wouldn't allow him to sit this one out. Midnight found them standing before the ruins, the desert night wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket.
The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced in the flickering light of their flashlights. The ruins themselves were little more than crumbling stones, half buried and weathered by centuries of wind and sand. Catherine could feel the weight of unseen eyes on them, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she forced herself to keep moving, her breath shallow, her hand trembling on her flashlight. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping out from behind a stone pillar. It was a man, tall, gaunt, his features sharp and angular, as if chiseled from the same stone that surrounded them. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly yellow that made Catherine's skin crawl. "You're the one who called," Wood demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The man smiled, a twisted, humorless grin. "I am merely a messenger sent to deliver you to the truth." Catherine's heart pounded in her chest. "What truth?" The man's grin widened. "The truth of the coming darkness, the truth that the servant of Baal seeks to reveal." Jeremy took a step forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Where is he?" The man's gaze shifted to Jeremy, his smile never wavering. "Closer than you think." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath their feet trembled, a deep rumble that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Catherine stumbled, her flashlight slipping from her grasp as the ruins around them began to shake. And then, from the shadows, they emerged. Figures cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden behind masks carved from bone, their bodies draped in tattered robes that fluttered like moths in the night air. They moved with unnatural grace, surrounding the trio in a circle, their movements synchronized, as if guided by some unseen force. Jeremy cursed, drawing his gun, but Wood grabbed his arm. "Don't," Wood hissed. "There's too many of them." The masked figures began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, the words in ancient, guttural language that made Catherine's skin crawl. The air grew colder, the wind whipping around them in a frenzy, carrying with it the scent of decay. The man who had led them here stepped forward, his arms raised in a gesture of triumph. "Witness the rebirth of the world, witness the dawn of a new age." Catherine's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The ritual, the murders, the cult, they were all part of some grand plan, a plan to bring something terrible into the world, something they had been powerless to stop, but she couldn't give up. Not now, not when they were so close. She reached out, grabbing Wood's arm. "We have to stop this, we have to." But before she could finish, the chanting reached a crescendo, and the earth beneath them cracked open, a blinding light spilling forth from the depths below. The light was unnatural, a sickly yellow that burned her eyes and seared her soul. It felt alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that threatened to consume everything in its path. The masked figures fell to their knees, bowing before the light as if in worship. The man who had led them here stood tall, his arms outstretched, his face alight with ecstasy. "He comes," the man whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "He comes to cleanse this world of its sin." Catherine knew, in that moment, that they were out of time. Whatever was coming through that rift in the earth, whatever darkness was about to be unleashed, they had to stop it, no matter the cost. "Jeremy, now!" she screamed, pulling her own gun and firing into the crowd of cultists. Jeremy didn't need to be told twice. He followed suit, his shots echoing through the night. The cultists barely reacted, their focus entirely on the ritual, but their distraction was enough. Wood charged forward, tackling the leader and sending them both crashing to the ground. Catherine ran toward the light, her every instinct telling her to stop, to turn back, but she pushed forward, her mind singularly focused on one thing: stopping this madness. The light grew brighter, hotter, until it felt like her very skin was being scorched by its intensity. She reached the edge of the rift, the chasm in the earth that had opened to reveal whatever lay below, and then she saw it. A figure, vast and terrible, rising from the depths. It was neither man nor beast, but something ancient and unknowable, its form shifting and writhing like a mass of shadow and flame. Eyes, hundreds of them, glowed with a sickly yellow light, each one filled with a malevolent intelligence that bore into her soul. This was it, the thing the cultists had been trying to summon. The will of evil made flesh. Catherine's breath caught in her throat.
There was no way they could fight this, no way they could survive it. But she couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it enter their world. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the small vial of holy water she had taken from the church earlier. It was a foolish gesture, a desperate act, but it was all she had. With a silent prayer, she hurled the vial into the rift. The reaction was immediate. The light flared, brighter than the sun, and a deafening roar echoed through the ruins. The ground shook violently, and the masked figures screamed in agony, their bodies writhing as the light consumed them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light vanished, the rift in the earth closing with a final thunderous crack. The masked figures lay dead or dying, their bodies twisted and broken. The man who had led them here was gone, his body crushed beneath the rubble. Catherine fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had done it. They had stopped it. But at what cost? Jeremy and Wood staggered over to her, both of them bruised and battered, but alive. They had survived, but the darkness lingered, a shadow that would never truly leave them. Catherine looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling innocently above them, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just been on the brink of destruction. She knew she would never forget this night. The things she had seen, the horrors she had faced, they would stay with her forever, etched into her memory like scars. But she also knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. The will of evil had been stopped, but the cult was still out there, and so was the servant of Baal. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of the darkness that lurked beneath the world, and there would be more battles to come. But for now, they had won, and that was enough. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the three of them stood together, their bond forged in fire and blood. They were tired, wounded, but they were alive, and they would keep fighting, for as long as it took. The sun rose, casting its light over the ruins, and for a brief moment the world seemed at peace. But in the shadows, the darkness stirred, waiting for its time to rise again. Epilogue. The gathering shadows. The small town of Ashwick was still as the first rays of sunlight broke through the thinning veil of night. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched earth, and a quiet unease lingered, as if the very land had absorbed the terror of the previous night. The ruins stood silent, a monument to a battle won but not the war. The morning birds dared not sing, and the wind was reluctant to stir, as if even nature itself feared what had been unleashed. Catherine, Jeremy, and Wood sat in their car on the edge of town, their faces pale and drawn, eyes hollow from the ordeal. They had fought the darkness and survived, but each of them knew the cost. The battle had left marks deeper than any visible wounds, scars that would fester in their minds long after the physical pain had faded. The drive back to headquarters was a silent one, the weight of their victory crushing rather than exalting. They had saved the world, but at the cost of their innocence, their sense of security. The world, it seemed, was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. As they drove away, none of them noticed the old woman standing in the doorway of a dilapidated house, her eyes following them with an unsettling intensity. Her face was lined with age, her hands knotted and gnarled, yet her posture was rigid, almost statuesque. She watched them go, her gaze never wavering, her lips curled into a knowing smile. Inside the house, in the dim light of a single flickering candle, a group of figures knelt in a circle. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their presence filled the room with a palpable sense of malevolence. They chanted in low, murmuring tones, their voices melding together in a haunting, otherworldly chorus. On the floor before them was an ancient symbol, drawn in blood, its lines intricate and precise, pulsing with a dark energy. The old woman stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She moved to the center of the circle, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the symbol as though it were the most precious thing in the world. The chanting stopped as she approached, the room falling into an oppressive silence. She knelt beside the symbol, her hands hovering over it, trembling with a mixture of reverence and anticipation. The old woman's smile widened as she looked up at the figures surrounding her, her eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. "The servant of Baal has not been defeated," she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet but unshakable certainty. The ritual was incomplete, but it has begun. The will of evil is awake, and it will not be so easily banished. The time of reckoning is upon us. The figures nodded in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. The old woman lowered her hands to the symbol, her fingers brushing against its surface. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle and plunging them into darkness. But even in the blackness, the symbol glowed faintly, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. "It is only a matter of time," she continued, her voice now barely more than a breath, yet filled with unshakable conviction. "The shadows are gathering. The will of evil will rise again, and when it does, it will be unstoppable. The world will burn, and from its ashes, a new order will emerge, an order where we shall reign supreme." The figures around her began to chant once more, their voices rising in a crescendo of dark worship. The room seemed to swell with the power of their words, the air thickening with the promise of doom. Outside, the sun finally broke free from the horizon, its light spilling across the town of Ashwick. The ruins of the old church stood tall, casting long shadows over the land, but in those shadows something moved, something that had been stirred from its ancient slumber. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The FBI agents had only delayed the inevitable, and the darkness that loomed on the horizon was more terrifying than they could ever imagine. The servant of Baal was waiting, biding his time, and the world was not ready for what was to come. The light of day may have returned, but the night had left its mark, a stain that would never be washed away. And as the old woman's laughter echoed through the darkened room, it was clear to anyone who might have heard it, if they dared listen, that the shadows were only just beginning to rise.